It's 1934, and in the harsh, boiling deserts that lie between the ancient cities of Damascus and Baghdad, a huge, shining vehicle blasts through the unforgiving landscape. At 80 feet long and weighing 26 tons, the massive 18-wheeler is the largest bus ever made, a one-of-a-kind vehicle designed to transport customers safely and comfortably on a 550-mile trip through the desert. Up to 40 passengers are spread over 2 levels of this bespoke desert bus, split between first and second class compartments. The luxurious reclining chairs of first class are a far cry from most transport options of the day, and insulated from heat or cold, passengers are protected from the worst effects of the extreme environment outside. As they settle in for their near 24-hour crossing, the onboard steward is on hand to serve fresh food and drinks from the trailer's built-in kitchenette, an extensive galley which boasts a 2-place range and refrigerator. At the front, a huge all-wheel drive tractor powers it all, manned by up to 3 drivers who ensure continuous operation day or night and who can sleep in revolving shifts from a small sleeping bunk in the cabin itself. While it may seem like something lifted straight out of the world of Mad Max, this custom coach was in fact one of several vehicles employed by the Nairn Transport Company throughout the 1920s, 30s and 40s, and used to ferry passengers across millions of miles of remote desert routes over their lifetime. In an era before the widespread adoption of air travel, the Nairn service was the most luxurious, reliable and fastest transport around, starting first with small, simple motor cars before eventually evolving into large, modern and custom buses and featuring numerous innovations, including the first ever air conditioning ever fitted to moving vehicles. But how did this amazing, unique service begin, and what happened to the Nairn's incredible desert buses? Before we get started today, I just wanted to say a big thank you to this video's sponsor, which is Odoo. Odoo is the most powerful, intuitive and customizable management platform ever made, and it can completely transform the way that you run your business, and it certainly transformed the way that we run our business. This is actually our little gallery and coffee shop that I run with my wife here on the Isle of Raasay. Odoo has a suite of apps that can cover all your company needs, whether that be point of sale, selling coffees here in the shop, to e-commerce and accounting behind the scenes, inventory, project or time management. Whatever you need, Odoo can help. Now, on top of all that, as well as allowing us to keep track of products that we're selling, coffees that we're making, we've also been using Odoo's amazing open source website builder to build a better new website for our shop and gallery. I think what I like the most is just the freedom of it. You're not having to deal with the limitations of other website builders and work around them. Instead, you can focus more on making the exact online experience that you want, and all backed up by the incredible suite of apps and integrations that Odoo helps provide. So no matter the size of your business, whether it's a sleepy coffee shop and gallery on a small Scottish island or a much more complex organization, if it's simple or specific, Odoo can be tailored to exactly what you need. Try it for yourself. The first application is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. Better yet, why not build a website hassle-free with Odoo's open source website builder? You can get hosting for free for life, and you'll get a custom domain name for free for your entire first year. Thanks again for the support, Odoo, and check out the link in the description below to see how Odoo can help you. Now, I'm going to get out of my little gallery coffee shop and get back to making my video on the Nairn Transport Company. By 1920, the Middle East was a burgeoning hotbed of new enterprises, nations and Anglo-French administrations. Rapid change and modernisation was spreading across the region, and alongside it, the motor car. Trucks and cars arriving in the Middle East, or left over from the war, had a problem, however. There were little to no trained mechanics or drivers who could keep them running, and few suitable roads to make use of. Brothers Norman and Gerald Nairn, originally born and raised on the South Island of New Zealand, had been in the Middle East since their military service during the First World War. They had been making a small living first selling and fixing motor cars out of Beirut before going on to found one of the region's first motor transport routes, running down the coast from Beirut to Haifa. While the route gained the brothers a name for themselves as skilled mechanics and businessmen, finances were constantly tight. By 1922, facing stiff competition from an increasing number of transport companies with deeper pockets and newer vehicles, the brothers were forced to close the route. However, the Nairns' mechanical expertise and skills in motor transport were well regarded, and soon the British consul in Damascus approached them about an ambitious expedition, crossing the Syrian desert by motor vehicle in hopes of establishing a viable route across the stretch of wilderness between British-administered Baghdad and the French-held Damascus. Such an expedition by motorcar was a significant and possibly dangerous undertaking, but they were encouraged by support from an unusual party. One of the region's most powerful sheikhs, Mohammed ibn Bassam, was interested in the idea. Bassam was well known for a gold smuggling operation between Damascus and Baghdad, and was looking for ways to avoid the traditional and slow-moving camel routes that were being preyed on by raiders and local French authorities. Bassam promised the brothers that he could ensure no harassment from local tribesmen that he had influence on in exchange for help setting up what could be a faster and more efficient transport route through the Syrian desert. The first convoy, consisting of 3 motor cars, the Nairns' old but reliable Buick, an Oldsmobile and a leased Italian Lancia, set off from Damascus on the 2nd of April 1923, packed with enough supplies to last 10 days and 1,000 miles of travel if needed, as well as several firearms should they come across rival or unfriendly tribesmen. 3 days after setting off, and having managed to navigate their cars through the depths of the Syrian desert, the party of travellers, including Sheikh Bassam himself, made it to Baghdad. The Nairns could see the potential immediately. With this new route, Norman's business acumen and Gerald's mechanical skills, the advantage over competitors was considerable. Airmail and passenger planes were in their extreme infancy and prohibitively expensive as well as unreliable. The only option for most goods, passengers or mail leaving the newly British-administered Baghdad for Europe was first via the port of Basra, then to Karachi or Bombay, and finally through the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean, a journey that would take upwards of 6 weeks. Nairn Transport's desert route had the potential to cut this journey down to just 10 days. Norman Nairn was soon promoting the new route and going one step further, a Baghdad to New York service in just 15 days, promising not just mail, but a passenger service with security on the route guaranteed from Sheikh Ibn Bassam himself. As newspapers of the time also noted, Norman was soon in America, looking to acquire a small fleet of well-regarded General Motors Cadillacs. These Type V63 touring cars proved supremely capable. Despite being loaded to carry 7 passengers, as well as a 16-gallon water tank, extra fuel canisters, and piled high with luggage, the Cadillac's powerful 83-horsepower V8 engines were fast and efficient, and cut down the journey time by 2 hours over the Nairns' existing vehicles. Despite the challenges and dangers, the service quickly grew in scale and revenue. What started first as a 2-car weekly convoy had soon grown to a regular service running up to 12 cars and travelling up to 70 miles per hour on some stretches, often outpacing competing airlines flying similar routes. By 1926, the Nairns had begun to use a variety of large Safeway buses, which gave far more comfort and cargo space for travellers, and which soon became a recognisable sight like the earlier Cadillacs, featuring on a number of company adverts and flyers. In a radio interview recorded during the height of their operations, Norman Nairn recalled the challenges of their service and the gradual increase of vehicles on the route, eventually culminating in their most impressive creation.
The heat in the summer runs up to 110 in the shade, and there is no shade. Sometimes it is found necessary to wear gloves to change a burst tyre because they get so very hot. Between Amman and Rutba, the cars had to cross a 40-mile belt of lava boulders. There was no boulder smaller than 6 inches in diameter. In the winter it gets very cold, and there are heavy rainstorms which turn the desert into a sea of mud, and frequently the buses stick. However, each bus carries 4 days of food, so the passengers do not suffer unnecessarily. In 1926, the old type Cadillac cars were changed into a 6-wheel deluxe bus, which carried 15 passengers in Pullman chairs. These were very successful and continued until 1930, when the company experimented with a light semi-trailer towed with a Buick Roadster. This was so successful, it gave us the idea to build a very large semi-trailer coach which came into service in 1934. This coach is 80 feet long and carries 40 passengers, has a buffet on board with oil toilet facilities. This is the largest bus in the world and weighs 26 tons.
The Nairn's huge Marmon Herrington was a revelation. It was the company's first attempt at a large custom-built vehicle designed entirely for their uses and needs, and was unlike almost anything on the road at the time. Marmon Herrington's all-wheel drive systems were well regarded, and the Nairns had seen them be put to great use by the Iraq Petroleum Company, which had been using them in their efforts to build oil pipelines across the Syrian desert. It was powered by a newly developed 188 horsepower Hercules diesel engine with a 12 forward-speed gearbox and 3 reverse gears. Should it ever become stuck, the trailer could be quickly unhitched and the tractor relocated to pull it out, an issue which had plagued the large and heavy Safeway buses. The main luggage hold was located in a large compartment at the rear of the trailer and a secondary compartment at the front, giving a total luggage capacity of almost 2.8 tons. The interior featured comfortable airplane-style recliners in first class and storage bins located on the ceiling that gave an extra 900 kilograms of storage. One level up on the rear of the coach was the second class compartment, which was slightly more cramped to make space for the cargo area under the floor and featured no overhead storage. The trailer also included a toilet, though it's not exactly clear where this was located, most likely between the first and second class compartments. At the front of the trailer was the kitchenette, a relatively spacious galley which contained the preparation area for meals and refreshments served during the journey. The kitchenette also contained the main phone connection, which could be used by the conductor or steward in the trailer to communicate with the drivers in the main tractor. Nairn vehicles would always operate with at least 2 drivers to ensure continuous operation and especially to prevent drivers falling asleep during the long nighttime drives through the wilderness. For the tractor, a small bunk was also located behind the driver's bench for one to rest on the 24-hour journey. The trailer was entirely custom, having been built at the Bender Body Company of Cleveland, and the tractor a modified design of one of Marmon Herrington's 3-axle all-wheel drive trucks. So the largest bus in the world made quite a splash with the local media of the time. If you go and look through records, you'll find quite a lot of information about its commissioning and its building, especially in local American newspapers from where it was built. But in terms of the sources out there to give us information about what this bus looked like and how it functioned, there isn't a huge amount. There's not that many photos of it. In fact, the best and some of the only photos of the interior, especially of this vehicle, come from this magazine, Popular Mechanics. It's actually March 1934. Now, I need to find the page. Funnily enough, I'm just looking through this right now, and there's an article in here about airmail beacons, and I made a video all about airmail beacons, and I had no idea I had a magazine that actually had loads of information about them. But anyway, you can go watch that video next. So here's the article here, and it's fantastic. Streamlined bus replaces camels in desert is the headline. And then these are 2 of the only, well, there's another couple of photos showing the second class compartment a little bit further back, but these are 2 of the only photos I've ever found of the interior of this bus, and most importantly to me anyway, includes the galley. You can see here details of the galley and how it functioned, and when it came to making that incredible 3D model that Brendan's put together, these were basically the only sources that we had to go on. Now it says here, travellers across the Syrian desert from Baghdad to Damascus can now use a modern motor coach instead of a camel. Of course, for like the past decade they've been using Cadillac cars, but anyway, an American manufacturer recently delivered 2 huge buses for this traffic, one for freight and the other almost as big as a Pullman car for carrying passengers. So they mentioned 2 vehicles there, a freight car and a passenger car, and that's true. So it was £8,000 the Nairns paid for the custom Pullman-style coach, as they called it. They also had delivered a more stock, conventional version of the Marmon Herrington all-wheel drive tractor with a much more boxy freight trailer. Because remember, one of the most important elements of the Nairn Transport Company's kind of sales pitch was the fact that you could take a lot of luggage with you. So not only could you travel in comfort, as you can see here, you've got a lovely, comfortable seat, you've got a kitchen and a galley serving you food and cold drinks. There was actually a fridge on board. It was essentially an ice box that you could fill from the outside, and you could put fruit and veg and stuff like that, keep that cold, but also it had a number of copper pipes running through it, and the water tank on board would be filtered through this ice box, and then coming out of this tap would be lovely cold water. Again, quite a luxury if you consider travelling going through the desert, the stifling heat. This was a huge part of the Nairn's sales pitch to customers, especially as the competition from aircraft got tighter and tighter. But the one thing that the Nairns always had over the aircraft up until, the very end was the fact that you got far more luggage. I think at the start, according to the old brochures that you can look through, you would get £60 of luggage for free included with your ticket. And I think it was 1 shilling per £1 that you went over your luggage allowance. Now, I think that actually went up with the buses. I think it went up to £75. And again, very significant when you consider that an aircraft at the time, unreliable or relatively unreliable, very reliant on good weather conditions and the like, not nearly as comfortable as what the bus service could offer with the Nairn Transport Company, and you got less luggage as well too, and it would have been more expensive as well. Now, the bus was used for about 10 years. It racked up hundreds of thousands of miles and trips across the desert. As you get into World War II, the service that they could offer was being interrupted obviously by the conflict, and at that point, around the same time that Norman Nairn probably did that interview, 1942, it was sold to the Royal Air Force, and the bus was actually used for transporting personnel to various air bases and around. And there is this incredible, I think, iconic photo of the bus. The only one I know of are from around that time period, in its kind of Royal Air Force garb, and nothing looks more Mad Max than that photo. I think it looks absolutely incredible. It's a sort of top-down photo. You can see some people standing around it. Now, after the war, the bus was sold again, but the Nairns didn't buy it. It was actually bought by a competitor to the Nairns. It was bought by a former employee and a mechanic that once worked for the Nairns, and he ran it out of Baghdad essentially as a competitor to the Nairn service, which was still ongoing at that point. But I think the lack of available parts and trying to keep this massive complex bus serviced, it was too much, and eventually it was sold on again. I've heard some reports that it lasted all the way until the 1960s, but I'm not sure. At that point, the trail runs cold on the largest bus in the world. And the Nairns had only owned it for about 10 years. They'd operated it all the way up until 1942. It had then been sold to the Royal Air Force. They then sold it on to people and it disappeared. But by that point, the Nairns had already moved on because they had taken what they had learned from the original largest bus in the world and they had used it to develop a new form of overland transport. From as early as 1934, the brothers, recognising the success of their desert buses, began designing a new version that would take on board the lessons learnt from the huge Marmon Herrington. Instead of a large passenger coach and freight lorry, it would instead be 2 custom-built twin coaches. These would be smaller than the earlier Marmon Herrington, doing away with the second class and instead carrying only 18 passengers, but in greater comfort and at higher speeds. The buses were also to average speeds between 60 to 65 miles per hour and cut down the crossing time to a mere 15 hours. The design would follow the successful tractor and trailer design, with a more sleek, streamlined and revolutionary for the time stainless steel body built by the American Budd Engineering Company, who had recently finished the famous stainless steel Pioneer Zephyr train. Powering it all would be a 150 horsepower Cummins diesel with a specially engineered radiator to cool the trucks during long desert runs. Perhaps most revolutionary, however, would be the air conditioning system. Norman was keen to work with Americans again, as their experience in air conditioning systems were well known, but fitting them to a coach or bus was almost unheard of. The solution, created by the Carrier engineering firm, was a 4-cylinder Continental engine, powering a compressor that could keep the internal temperature of the bus at a comfortable 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a development that proved incredibly popular, and Carrier would go on to use their newly developed product in a range of trains and buses, kickstarting a trend for air conditioning in vehicles that would only gain more and more popularity as the decades went on. So it's taken me about 2 years to track down this magazine. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I ended up finding this in a small bookshop in Canada, and the owner of the shop was kind enough to send this all the way over to me. This is Modern Mechanics. It's a competitor. It was a competitor to Popular Mechanics, and this is the October 1937 edition. And the reason that I have been looking for it for so long is for this incredible article. So this lovely article here is about the two Pullmans, the final iteration, the ultimate expression of the Nairn Transport Company's drive to make the most luxurious overland transport that they could. And in many ways, these two buses were like the final iteration on all the lessons learned throughout the years, all the way from the early Buicks and Cadillacs to the buses, the Marmon Herrington, the biggest bus in the world at that time. And then they finally culminated in these slightly smaller, more nimble overland buses, but built with a higher degree of luxury and comfort, which were competing again with the airlines of the time and aiming for speed and efficiency as well too. It actually mentions in this article here, the new buses lop 9 hours from former crossing time and make the 600-mile trip over the trackless waste in 15 hours, while passengers comfortably sway on rubber cushions. And these buses were tremendously successful. I've always been a little bit more interested in the Marmon Herrington because it's just such a huge and unique thing. But these buses were the real workhorses, and they put in the work. I think, but they said in one of these books, by 1956, these buses had racked up close to 1 million miles in the constant traversal back and forth across the desert. And that's a testimony not only to the buses, but also the engineering and the workshops and the teams of engineers that were keeping these buses running. These buses also represented Nairn Transport Company at its height. I would say that the height of the company was around 1939, because at that point they still had the Marmon Herrington bus, they still were using their older Safeway buses, and they had these two brand new Pullman buses. So there was a constant stream of traffic moving in all of these different routes that they had developed, and that is really, I think, when they had reached their peak of what the business was achieving. And then, of course, there was a lot of disruption that came from the war. Once they had sold on their company and Nairn Transport Company had sort of dissolved, the buses still remained. The Marmon Herrington, we think, maybe ran up until the 1950s, 60s. These buses, the final report that I have found, maybe one of these was still in operation around 1970. Now, that's quite remarkable when you consider that by 1956, these buses had racked up close to 1 million miles of traversal across the desert, and they still lasted potentially all the way up until the 1970s. Again, a real testament to the engineering that went into these. So, what happened to the Nairn Transportation Company in the end? Can you still jump on a Pullman bus, an air-conditioned coach, and drive in style from Baghdad to Damascus or thereabouts? No, I'm sure you can jump on a bus, and I'm sure the highway that you drive down from Damascus to Baghdad follows a very similar route to that one pioneered by the Nairns back in 1922, 1923, but it won't be a Nairn Transportation bus. The Nairn Transportation Company officially dissolved in 1956, but interestingly, Norman and Gerald Nairn weren't part of the company at that point. In 1946, Gerald wanted out. He wanted to retire. He wanted to move back to New Zealand, his homeland, and retire there. And Norman decided to stay a couple of years longer. It was 1948 by the time that he kind of got the last of the company affairs in order. And he then moved around the world. I think he got married 3 different times. But the company was worth a lot of money. It was valued at £80,000, a lot of money for those days. They had made a lot of money during the war, moving personnel and offering transport to the military. After the war, there was still a massive demand for overland transport. Aircraft still hadn't, eclipsed them in that way. But what they decided to do, they had offers from the Iraq government, interest from various parties to purchase the business. They actually sold it to their employees. The Nairn Company had always paid their employees very well. They had demanded a lot of them. They worked them very, very hard, but they had paid much higher rates and better salaries than any other competition, and that's what kept their very skilled drivers and mechanics retained in the company. So what they ended up doing was selling it to the employees, but unfortunately the local conditions were getting more difficult in the area. In 1948, the British had moved out of Palestine. There was a lot of internal conflict starting to bubble and boil, issues around the borders, and more than anything, the Suez Crisis really started to exacerbate stuff. And it had to mean that a lot of people who once worked for the company, who were British and English and New Zealanders and the like, and Americans, ended up fleeing to avoid the conflict. The whole company ended up basically collapsing. There was actually apparently a smuggling operation that had developed between the Damascus to Baghdad run. Quite interesting, harkens back to those early days with Sheikh Ibn Basan and his smuggling operation. But with these vehicles, which had been used now for smuggling, it was alleged, seized by the authorities, there wasn't enough money to release them. The shareholders didn't have enough capital on hand, and basically the company collapsed. And it must have been obviously quite a sad experience for the Nairns, who'd built this company up, handed it to their employees and the people that they had worked with over the years, and then seeing the entire thing falling apart. A lot of their colleagues and people that they had worked with for years basically had to leave the Middle East with absolutely nothing as a result of this entire company kind of basically falling apart. But a fascinating story. The fact that they had managed to keep this business going and running throughout all of those years, I think, is actually quite remarkable. And the level of development, moving from those tiny little Buick Roadsters all the way up eventually to these huge, massive buses featuring air conditioning, something which, not even the most luxury trains of the day anywhere in the world would have featured, is really quite remarkable. I do sometimes think maybe somewhere out there in the Middle East right now is the old scrapped stainless steel car of one of these Pullmans. Maybe it's just sitting out there in a scrapyard. Maybe it's been repurposed as a garage or a shed or a workshop or something. It's amazing sometimes how many of these things suddenly crop up. So you never know. Maybe one day some of the Nairn transportation heritage will eventually kind of bubble back up to the surface. But anyway, amazing topic. I've been wanting to tell you guys about this for years because it was a friend of mine, Blair Bowman, who sent me this on Twitter. He said, "Hi, have you ever heard of this?" And it was a 3D model somebody had made, I think for a truck simulator of that massive Marmon Herrington. And I was like, wow, that's a really odd. And I looked it up and I couldn't find anything about it. And then I ended up ordering, where's the book? This book. Nairn Bus to Baghdad by J.S. Tullett. This is basically the tome. If you want to know the story of the Nairn brothers, this is the one to look at. This has a lot of fantastic photos, has all the history that you could ever possibly want to know. And I started diving into it and I just became obsessed. And that's when I contacted Brendan, who had done the 3D model for the Rescue Boy, also done the 3D model for the Kamuna. And I said to him, okay, I've got one more thing. Can you make from 8 photos? That's the only photos I have of this whole thing. Can you make this entire 3D model up? And he did. I mean, that 3D model is incredible. I think I need to make a kind of highlight reel that just shows that 3D model, because it is remarkable the amount of detail that he has managed to get into it, despite the fact that we literally have maybe a dozen good quality photos of what this thing actually looked like. Really, really amazing. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thanks again to my patrons for all your help and support. As always, I will tell you what I'll do. I'll scan as much as I can of all of these magazines, and I'll put them up on my Patreon page so you guys can have a look at this stuff in closer detail. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.